friends, my name is Jess. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Before we get into the wrap up, I just wanted to apologize for not having a video out last week. It's just end of May was not a good time for me. I needed a break from doing literally anything and everything at all. I also had a major reading slump in the last week or two of May, so I didn't read as many books as I would have wanted to read. I only read, 8 books? I attempted to read 8 books. There was one book that I DNF'd, and then I ended up having one 1-star read, one 3-star read, 4 4-star reads, and then 1 5-star read. I've organized the books based on their rating, so I start from the DNF and then the 1-star book all the way up to the 5-star book. And then within each star rating, they're roughly ordered in terms of least to most liked. Don't read into that one too much. So we are going to start with the first and only DNF that I've had this entire year, which was Hamnet by Maggie. I tried reading this for, I think it was the 20-something book club, and listen, I'm proud of myself, to be honest, because I really need to DNF more. I'm trying to be more in tune with what brings me joy. This one did not. This is a historical fiction that tries to give a backstory to the creation of the play Hamlet. As the story goes, Shakespeare does factually have 3 children, including a young son named Hamnet who died when he was young from the plague, and then supposedly a few months after his son's death, Shakespeare wrote the play Hamlet. I really tried to stick it out with this story. I really gave it my best shot, but by the time I got to 35% and I realized that I wasn't even halfway through the book yet, I could not take it anymore. This book has such long, flowery writing, and in some cases I like flowery, descriptive writing. It's hard to explain why it does or does not work in different situations, but I think here it's because it serves so little purpose. Descriptions go on for so long, it started to feel useless. I forgot what it was even talking about by the time we ended the description. The 35% that I read felt endless. To give you a minor but vague spoiler, so just skip to the 1-star section if you don't want to hear it, but I want to give you an example of what I mean. There was a sex scene where the entire sexual act was summarized in like a sentence or 2 and was preceded by paragraphs upon paragraphs of how the apples around them were shifting and moving. I just can't. For anyone who's interested, there's also like a kind of witchy vibe. Hamnet's mother, who I would say is more of a main character than Shakespeare is, I don't know, has some kind of premonition or like powers or something of that sort. I wasn't opposed to it, but it did feel like an odd addition to the story. And speaking of DNFs, I should have DNF'd this 1-star read. I read Devdas by Saratchandra Chattopadhyay for the movie night book club that's hosted by the Roomies Digest. And the only reason I did not end up DNFing it is because it was so short. It was only 100 pages, so like might as well just finish it. Apparently, this is a classic Indian romance following Devdas and his relationship with his childhood sweetheart and a courtesan. I'm not going to say more about the story than that because it's literally like 120 pages or something. The Goodreads description literally outlines everything that happens in the story. So if you want more, I mean, read that. I fully don't understand why this is a classic or why there are supposedly so many adaptations of it. Devdas is not a good guy, okay? He's arrogant, he's mean, he's cruel, he's straight up abusive. There are horribly textbook scenes of Devdas hitting one of the girls and then apologizing and saying that she shouldn't have provoked him. And the girls just continue to care for him. They go along with it. The only comeuppance Devdas gets in this entire story is the fact that he's self-destructive. It's nothing that the girls themselves really did. I just found nothing romantic about this story. It's a horrible model for relationships, and I can only hope that the author intended for it to be a bad model. Besides that, it was also just generally boring to me. I don't think the translation did it any favors either. Moving on to the books that I actually liked this month, I also read Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda, which I gave 3 stars to. This is a queer historical fiction taking place in 1950s San Francisco. We're following Lily, an Asian American teen, as she's figuring out her sexuality with the help of a fellow teen, Kathleen Miller, and a lesbian bar known as the Telegraph Club. I do feel kind of bad giving this 3 stars because I know everybody loves this book, everybody raves about this book, but hear me out because I think I have very good reason for giving this 3 stars. This is a good book. I'm glad to have read it, but it has some flaws. I think a major reason why I ended up giving it 3 stars is because the synopsis synopsis makes a big point about the fact that this takes place during the Red Scare and Lily's father is facing the threat of deportation. Those things are true, and I do think this book does a good job of portraying the more casual, everyday racism, such as Lily constantly being referred to as China doll, and also the more life-altering, harmful racism, such as being accused of being a communist by FBI agents, for instance. However, it would have been very, very easy to edit out the whole Red Scare part of the story. It would have been ridiculously easy to edit out the whole deportation thread of the story, which to me just says that it was a very underdeveloped part of the plot. The deportation threat is mentioned, but it's barely brought up after the first instance, and communism in the community is also talked about a bit, but it's like maybe 5% of the story. They were like loose threads that were dropped, I don't know, halfway through the book, and they just were never resolved, never talked about again. And because it's in the synopsis, I was expecting an edge of my seat kind of story while waiting to figure out what would happen with Lily's dad and the deportation threat. That never happened, and it was a bit of a disappointment. This is actually a very slow type of story, and it's a good kind of slow in my opinion, but it's just, it wasn't what was marketed to me, and I think that it set some expectations that the book didn't reach and then resulted in me not enjoying it as much as I could have had I known what I was signing up for. This book also had some flashback portions to it, which I didn't hate or anything, but I feel like they didn't serve a purpose. I kept expecting the flashbacks to connect to the story in a larger way and like it would all come together at the end, and it just didn't. Yeah, and that's why I gave it 3 stars. Like I mentioned, Last Night at the Telegraph Club is a slow book because it's a more introspective book. This, more than any other book I've ever read, perfectly captures what it feels like to be a young queer woman figuring out my sexuality. Malinda perfectly captures the confusion and the feeling of things finally clicking into place and the feeling of not yet belonging in queer spaces but still being unable to tear your eyes away from it, and just a feeling like you're gonna burst from how much more you are now. And she also perfectly captures what it feels like to be falling in love for the very first time. The relationship between Lily and Kathleen is just so sweet and so very much a teen romance. There are some more hormonal scenes, let's say. I would not at all call it spicy, but you know, it's more than kissing, so that you know. I also think Lo did a fantastic job of setting the scene. The descriptions and the details of everything felt very 1950s. I felt like I was in the Telegraph Club when she was describing, you know, the smoky air and vibe, all of the people there, the drinks, the performances, all of that. This is a point and part of history that I have never read about before, and it was cool to see some of queer history, particularly in the underground bars, and seeing how women would go about their lives as lesbians in that time period. And speaking of, we got some older lesbians, and I love the mentoring gays. I love them so much. It was great to see a sense of community because I feel like LGBT books so often focus on the more isolation portion of it, figuring yourself out. Beyond that, there was also well-written, complicated family and friend relationships. Fair warning, there is some outing in this story, so be prepared for that. So all in all, it's a flawed book. I wouldn't call it like a page turner or anything, but as a book that looks into that time period and into the lesbian experience, it was really good. Next, we're moving on to the 4-star category with Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This is a sci-fi novel where basically humans have found a life form, a virus, a bacteria, I don't know, that's essentially leeching energy from the sun. And it's happening at such a rate that humans have a limited amount of time to figure out the problem and fix it before Earth becomes uninhabitable. The story starts out with our main character waking up on a spaceship with absolutely no memory of any of that, and as the sole survivor of a last-ditch effort to save the entire planet. To fully explain how I felt about this book and whether or not this might be a good sci-fi novel for you, I just want to explain what I consider my scale of science within sci-fi novels. To me, there are 3 kinds of science in a sci-fi novel. 1, you have just enough science to call it a sci-fi novel, but it barely talks about the science. It's mostly just there to set a premise, you know, a framework for the actual story and plotline. 2, definitely has some science. The story somewhat relies on talking about the science, science. And boy, does it talk about the science. But the explanations are generally straightforward. They're very easy to understand if you take the time to read through them. And if you don't feel like taking the time to read through them, I also think you'd be able to skim through the science, get the general idea, and just enjoy the plot. And then 3 is just so much science. Unless you have experience with sci-fi or some, I don't know, foundational background of all of these common scientific theories that you would find in like space books, this is maybe over your head levels of science. You're gonna read each explanation multiple times level of science. And there's possibly more science than there is plot. Basically, you need to get it to really understand what the characters are talking about and what's going on, and you just can't skim it. Project Hail Mary is a 2. I'll be honest, I skimmed some of the sciencey parts, but the explanations were very understandable, and I thought it was very interesting too to think about how this situation would work if it was actually happening in real life. That being said, the science does make this story kind of a denser book. There's not as much of an urgency as I would expect with a last-ditch save the planet kind of story, but you are definitely rooting for a solution. This is a dual timeline kind of story where the main character starts getting his memories back, and as he gets his memories back, you get flashbacks into him finding out what was going on and how he became a part of this mission and just kind of all of the events leading up to him being on this spaceship. And I really enjoyed the flashbacks. I think that's where you get more of the human emotion and the urgency that's added to the story. And I also think that's really where you start to understand who this character is. Project Hail Mary, just so you know, is very much in the main character's head, which I found very annoying at first because, being in my own head is cringy sometimes, let alone being in somebody else's head. People don't think in very eloquent ways. I was cool with it by the end of it. I think I got over it pretty quickly, and I think it was mostly because of the flashbacks where I got to understand the character and why he thinks the way that he does. I think if you can vibe with the science level, you should give it a try. This is very much a story about discovery and sacrifice, and above all, friendship. And I will say that at about the 25% mark, something major happens that changes what this story is, because it is so much more than the synopsis I just gave you. And if you don't want to know more than the synopsis, just read until then. I promise you'll know it when you see it. If you do want to know what the twist is at the 25% mark, I will let you know, but if you don't, skip to the next book. I'm just gonna say 2 words, alright? First Contact. Next is These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. Yes, I finally read this book. This book has been on my TBR since it came out in 2020 or something like that. I have lost count the amount of times I have mentioned on my channel that I want to read this book. I am so glad that I finally did it. These Violent Delights is a historical fantasy retelling of Romeo and Juliet. This takes place in 1920s Shanghai, where our main characters are the heirs to rival gangs. Our main characters used to be in love, but they had an unknown falling out and haven't spoken to each other until now, where they have to team up to solve a mysterious and gruesome plague that is sweeping through the city. I'll be honest, I do not think that These Violent Delights is going to stick with me. I think by next year I will have just forgotten about it and I won't think about it again. But it is a story that I enjoyed while I was reading it. I honestly think I was more interested in the mystery aspect of the story than I was about the relationships, which with the Romeo and Juliet retelling, I don't know that that's actually supposed to happen, but I really wanted to know about this plague and the supposed monster associated with it, and I thought it was pretty well done. I wouldn't say it's the most unique plague in the world or anything, but it was interesting, it was fun to read about, and I do think it hits several points that will make people uncomfortable in a good way. And I do think things kept moving at a really good pace, but the flowery language and descriptions were a bit excessive sometimes. And I don't want to criticize it that much, to be honest, because this kind of flowery language is also the kind of writing style that I tend to favor as well. So I'm really not gonna criticize someone for writing in the same way that I would write, but there is a fine line between enhancing the setting or the events or whatever and just droning on and pulling people away from the point. Gong toes the line, and sometimes she crosses the line, which was annoying every now and then, but it wasn't so pervasive that I couldn't enjoy the descriptions or I couldn't enjoy the story. It's just, it might not be for everyone. While I was more interested in the mystery aspect of it, I did really like the relationships in here, including the relationships with and between the side characters, but they are overall underdeveloped as hell, including the main relationship. In all fairness, this is a duology, so I'm not upset about it. I just think that someone definitely would need to read the second book in order to be satisfied with this one. And I haven't read the sequel yet, so I'm not yet satisfied. I'm a couple pages into it, but then I hit my reading slump and I just haven't gotten into it any further. What I will say is that all of the characters in this story are very much their own people. They have their own flaws, they have their own motivations, which I did love, but again, it's it's underdeveloped. There was very little growth in any of the characters. So I think how I feel about this book is gonna be heavily influenced by the sequel and how everything is wrapped up and how people and plot lines grow and develop. There's just a lot that I still want to see. There's some tensions I want resolved. Next, we've got The Lighthouse Witches by C.J. Cooke, which I did read for the Winers Book Club, but unfortunately, I did not realize the live show was going on until like the day after. So I missed the live show and I'm very upset with myself about it. But anyway, this is a fantasy mystery following 2 timelines. In the first timeline, we have single mother Liv, who has taken her 3 daughters to live on a remote Scottish island while she paints a lighthouse that she was commissioned to paint a mural on. As the timeline progresses, you do learn that this lighthouse was built on top of a prison where centuries before accused witches were held. And then in the second timeline, 22 years have passed, and one of the daughters, Luna, still wonders what happened when her sisters and mother abruptly vanished. One day, Luna gets a call saying that her sister Clover has been found, but Clover is still 8 years old, exactly as she was the day she went missing, and Luna has heard stories about wildlings, demon creatures that take the place of children. Much like these Violent Delights, this is another story that it's really not going to stick with me, but I enjoyed it while I was reading it, and I did enjoy this one more than these Violent Delights, I think. Not because I think it's objectively better, it was just, I don't even know how to explain it. It was just more fun. It is a bit of a slower pace than I expected, so it kind of dragged on, but I was really interested in the mystery and figuring out what happened to her sisters and her mom, and like if Clover was really Clover or if she was a wildling. I loved the witchy aspect, and I really have to give the author props because I did not guess what the plot twist was gonna be until the very end. I mean, I wasn't trying to figure it out or anything, but sometimes it's just so obvious that even if you're not trying, it's just like, of course that's what it is. I didn't think about it, and I don't know about everyone else's opinions, but I thought the twist was very fun. It was very much, for me, in kind of moment, you know? I forgot to mention, on top of the 2 timelines that we're following, we're also getting excerpts from a journal from someone who lived on the island during the time of the witch hunts. So it's through those journal excerpts that we're really learning the truth of what happened in that time period and how it relates to the events that happened with Liv and her daughters. I wish I could explain to you why I enjoyed it further, but it was just a fun time for me. I don't think anything about it is super standout, but you know, if you like witchy vibes, if you like the remote island aesthetic, which here definitely includes like the storms and the tensions between locals and outsiders and all of that kind of stuff, or familial relationships, then you should give it a shot. Next, we've got Elena Knows by Claudia Pineiro. This was a book that was recommended to me by Rita from Life Worth Reading. I'm so glad that I read it because this one is gonna stick with me. This is a short Argentinian novel chronicling Elena, who is struggling with and trying to work around her very advanced form of Parkinson's as she is trying to figure out the truth behind her daughter's supposed suicide. I think this would be a very difficult book for some people to read. And I want to preface this by saying that I don't have any personal experience with this. I don't have any expertise on the topics at hand, so I can't speak to the accuracy of it. From my understanding of it, it seems accurate. But this book does go into detail about the struggles Elena faces. Her life basically revolves around her medicine, which allows her limited mobility. As her medicine fades from her system, moving becomes much more difficult until Elena is basically incapable of moving at all. And even with the medicine, every movement takes an extreme amount of effort. And the author, I think, does a very good job of putting us in Elena's body. You are there for every second of Elena's struggle. This does mean that the pace of the book is very slow because each moment is stretched out as you get descriptions of Elena and what's going through her head as she's attempting to do something as simple to an able-bodied person, that is, as lifting her foot. I think this is the closest I have ever gotten to understanding what it means to be disabled, which, to be clear, does not mean that I understand what it means to be disabled. I don't think anyone can understand it unless they themselves are. But with this book, I felt exhausted just reading it. I felt frustrated and anxious, and at times I felt distressed, and I felt scared along with Elena because her daughter Rita was her main and only caregiver, and her Parkinson's is only getting worse, and everything is already so difficult. I think people should read this to get a better understanding of how some people live. violence. That being said, there are some aspects that I think would turn people off from this book. We do get flashbacks showing the relationship between Elena and her daughter Rita, and I'm just telling you right now, they have a toxic relationship. I think it's clear to the reader that Elena does love her daughter, but neither she nor Rita are very good at expressing that care for each other. They were not kind to each other at all. They were mean and they were snippy, and Rita made some very insensitive comments to Elena in her role as a caregiver. There is also a heavy theme of abortion in this story, and I'm not going to spoil the context for it, but I do want to say that Elena and especially Rita's views on abortion are not good in my opinion, and I think it's also very obvious that it's not good in the author's opinion, who herself was an abortion rights activist. So just be aware that the two main characters are not necessarily likable people, and they may be people that you very much do not agree with. Even so, this book to me was a very real depiction of disability, how disabled people are treated in society, and also caregiver burnout. Elena and Rita are very real people, and real does not always mean good people, and it does not always mean people who make what you may consider the morally correct choice. So I would just keep that in mind. Personally, I didn't really like either of the characters, and I don't think we're meant to very much like them, but I mean, this is a book that I would never regret reading. I don't know, it's just a depiction that I'm going to remember for a long time because it put things into perspective for me. There is so much more privilege than I ever really think about in my day-to-day, and it's important for people to think about that and to realize that this world is not built for disabled people. And the way this world works and the way that the medical system works just makes things harder for them than it should be. I could probably do like a whole separate review video for this book, and maybe if I get around to giving it a reread later in the year or next year, I will do a whole separate review video for it because I think there's a lot to talk about with this one. And if any of you choose to read this, please let me know. All right, and the last book that I'm going to talk about, the only 5-star book from May, is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is another book that I've been meaning to read for years. I am so proud of myself. I'm on a roll this year with finishing books that I have told myself I'm gonna read for ages. The Poppy War is a military fantasy book inspired by real historical events that took place in 20th century China. We're following Rin, who did what everyone thought was impossible by acing an empire-wide test and securing a spot in the most prestigious military academy. It's a difficult journey for Rin, however, not only because the other students and even professors look down on her for being a poor, dark-skinned country girl. Rin has to grapple with sabotage, but she also has to deal with these rare, mysterious shamanic powers that have long been considered to be a myth, but may turn out to be the key to protecting her country during the Third Poppy War. This is such a massive story. There is so much that can be said about it. And if I tried to get into every single thing about this book, I think we would be here for another 20 minutes. I'm just gonna try to summarize my feelings about this. I was initially intimidated by the Poppy War. That's why it took so long to read it, but honestly, this was so much easier to read than I thought it would be. And I don't mean in terms of like the content, we'll get to that, but in terms of keeping track of the characters and the events and the places, it was a lot easier than I expected. Sometimes I got a little bit confused, but never so much that I couldn't quickly catch up and understand what was going on. There is a lot of discussion about military strategy, which was one of the parts that I was worried about. Overall, I understood all of it, and if I didn't feel like reading all of the nitty-gritty details about military strategy, I just skimmed over it and I got the picture. In terms of plot, a lot happens in this book. It is so much. It starts from before Rin takes the test while she's studying it. We go through the entire academy. We get into the war as well. And especially in the latter half of this book where the war has started and everything is going down, there is a very quick pace and there's a sense of danger and anxiety to it. Like I can't even imagine what's going to happen in book 2 and 3 because shit, some other authors would have made the concepts of this book and stretched it out into 2 books by itself. But that doesn't mean it feels rushed or anything, you know? I think it's a good pace to keep someone really gripped. Like I mentioned, the war is really going on in the second half and it does get very graphic sometimes. It's graphic, it's gruesome, it's awful. Pretty much every trigger warning that you can imagine in a wartime takes place in this book. There are also trigger warnings for drug addiction as well. And it feels a little wrong to say this, but let me try to explain it because I really appreciated all of that. But the reason why I appreciated it is because yes, it's very painful and it's sickening to read, but it's so real. R.F. Kuang doesn't shy away from the horrors of war or from how much opposing forces can dehumanize a population and therefore not even care about brutalizing and murdering people. And while I would say that one side is very clearly the bad bad guys in this story, that doesn't absolve Rin's side of the war either. This book is morally gray at its finest, okay? There are no good decisions to make in war. And all of the characters here make choices that at the time they felt were necessary, but did result in a lot of pain and suffering and death. There is no hero. There is no good, morally righteous person in this story. There's only people trying to survive and thinking that they're fighting for a good cause and striking out at other people because they have been hurt so badly. I think this book is amazingly real, and I think it's real even with the fantastical shamanic powers. Even those powers just adds a layer of complexity and struggle for our main character. And the Poppy War did something that I think books very rarely do for me, and which I think speaks volumes about how well R.F. Kuang did in writing this. This book made me want to pick up a nonfiction and learn everything that I could about the historical events that it was founded on. Don't get me wrong, like I do like learning, but nonfiction books are just difficult for me. I lose focus a lot, but this book made me so eager to know more. I feel like eager is like a bad word to use here because this is very horrible things that happened in history, but I say that because it feels vitally important to know more and to acknowledge this part of history that I didn't know about before. This was just an amazing book. That's what I can say. It gripped me, and it was amazing to see the way the characters progressed in both good and bad ways. I think there's a lot that people can learn from this story in terms of racism and colonization and the horrors of war, like I've mentioned. There's a lot that people can take away from this if they think that they can mentally and emotionally handle reading the topics in this. And I also want to say, I think this book was made for movie or TV adaptations. Just in the way that it was described, especially in the first half, I can just see the training montages from Rin's time at the academy. So yeah, this was fantastic. I finished reading this book and I immediately bought The Burning God. Not The Burning God, oh my god. I immediately bought The Dragon Republic. I had to buy the second book, and then of course I hit my slump and I didn't finish it. I'm only like 100 pages into it. So yeah, that is my May wrap up. I hope y'all enjoyed hearing my thoughts on these books. If you've read any of these books yourselves, please let me know your thoughts down below. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.